Hello, I'm John Stoker from Dialogue Works. The title of this presentation is, Why Don't Your Conversations Work? 7 Barriers to Effective Communication. The main reason that our conversations don't work is because we're not very informed about the difference between what we would call the tacit versus the explicit. You'll notice the diagram there on the slide is a figure that you're probably all familiar with called the Vitruvian Man that was drawn by Leonardo da Vinci. The actual circle and the square are in the drawing if you go look it up. Da Vinci said that the square represents science and that the circle represents art in considering the dimension of the human body. When I first saw this, I was shocked because I realized that Da Vinci was also talking about communication. Only in communication, the square represents the explicit and the circle represents the tacit. What's so interesting about this is, I often refer to this as the 93-7 rule. The explicit in a conversation is the words or the framework of a conversation that only makes up 7% of the conversation itself. The other 93% of the conversation is what we call the tacit. The tacit includes the visual, vocal, verbal, and mental aspects that are present in every conversation. What's so interesting about this phenomenon is this explains why oftentimes communications training that we attend or even our conversations don't work, because we focus on the words. Well, what do I say in this situation? As opposed to all the other elements. Visual, vocal, verbal, mental aspects as well. The bottom line is to ignore the tacit, maybe to assure 93% of a chance that our conversation won't work. So what does the tacit include? The tacit part of a conversation would include our assumptions. Not only the assumptions that we hold about a person in a conversation, but the assumptions that they hold about us as well. Also the context. Context would include the situation and even our past history. For example, I wouldn't talk the same way at a funeral on a Saturday morning that I spoke to my friends at a football game on a Friday night. That's the context. Intent deals with purpose or wants, the intent for holding the conversation to begin with. Emotion deals with what we're feeling and what we display in terms of that feeling. But it also includes the other person, what they're feeling, and what they in fact are displaying as well. Tempo deals with how fast the conversation is moving, the actual pacing of how people are talking to each other. Energy obviously includes the type of energy that a person brings to the conversation that they are displaying. Relationships/history deals with the current status of the relationship that you have with the person to whom you are speaking. And the history would include all your past experience or history with that individual. All that impacts the conversation that you're holding. Nonverbals would include facial expressions, gesture, and general body movements, which are portrayed as people speak to one another. Tone is kind of the tenor of the message. I like to refer to it as the music of the mind. So the things that we're thinking, we're assuming, and we bring to the conversation often come out in the tone or the tenor in the way that we speak. Inflection has to do with the emphasis that we give certain words, which actually change the meaning. Pauses has to do with spacing. In a document, we look for white space that rests the eyes. In conversation, we look for pause, which acts as the white space that allows a person to think and process what we're saying in the conversation. And finally, interaction style. We all have a different style from other people with whom we're speaking. And oftentimes, our style and delivery gets in the way or creates defensiveness on the part of people. All this would include the tacit. So you'll note, if we don't understand the tacit elements of a conversation, nor how to manage these elements or use them to our benefit, we increase the likelihood that our conversation may not work because of them. Let's begin then by talking about the actual barriers to communication. And we've listed 7 here. Let me go through them quickly, and then what I'll do is just take them one at a time, talk about how they impact our conversations, and then offer some solutions or some things that you might do to overcome them, improve upon them. So notice number one on the hit parade is our perception, how we actually perceive things. Awareness, or perhaps we should say our lack of awareness, kind of gets us in trouble. Everybody seems to have a problem with emotion when it's present and what to do with it. That can hinder our conversations. Beginning deals with how we actually begin or start a conversation to begin with. Understanding, or perhaps I should have put questioning, is that we don't ask questions very often for a variety of reasons, which keeps us kind of, if you want, siloed and doesn't allow our understanding to expand. It's also an element of perception. Our understanding doesn't often increase because perceptually we think we know what people are going to talk about. We also lack skills and a process, or what we would call a framework, for holding any difficult or tough conversation. That becomes a barrier. Last but not least, listening, or maybe we should say not listening, also becomes a barrier as well. Let's take these one at a time and take some time to talk about them so that we're sure about what they mean. Let's begin with the number one barrier, which is perception. Our perception is nothing more than our interpretation of what we think reality is and how it works. Let's take a moment and talk about how we process our perceptions, or if you want, how we think. You'll notice in the little box to the left there's a tree. All of us make observations through the five senses, through a little lens that I've labeled mental models. But if you were a Covey fan, he would refer to this lens as your paradigm. Hiram Smith, the founder of the Franklin Daytimer Company, would refer to it as your belief window. Call it what you will, but we've been constructing this filter since the time we were very, very young that we make observations through. As we observe, we engage in the process of selection. Selection just means that we don't see the whole event for how it is. So if I look at a tree, I may just focus on or select a branch with a few leaves on it. Any of you looking at the same event might see the whole tree, or the shape of the tree, or the kind of tree it actually is. The point is that we don't all see the same events in the same way. Here's where it becomes tremendously interesting. We take the selected pieces of data that we're looking at, or choosing if you want, and assemble them like pieces of a puzzle in our head and make some interpretation about what those selected pieces of information all mean. Sometimes we interpret correctly, but more often than not, we don't. Our interpretations then, which would be included in judgments, opinions, assessments, sometimes cause us to become emotional. Sometimes not. We don't get emotional at everything that we see or interpret. But when we become emotional, and that emotion is hot or negative, we do know that what then ensues is usually a reaction of some type or another. So note that our interpretation either leads us to act or react. If we're cool, calm, and collected, and we're conscious in the way that we think about things, then our interpretation would lead us to an action or a behavior, to say and do things. On the other hand, if we're emotional, and that emotion is negative, usually we react. So the things that we say and do are the result of some reaction that we have to what it is that we're observing, selecting, and then interpreting. Our action and then reaction, if you want, our behavior, then leads to some type of results, which we then interpret as a reinforcement for the way that we originally thought. Understanding how this process works is very important in understanding how perception becomes a barrier. Notice, we don't see most of the time beyond our own filters or perception. That's the problem. So one, we assume that we are understanding one another. Why? Because we think that we do, when in reality, it's nothing more than our version of reality in terms of what we understand, and not our understanding as complete. Let me give an example. Recently, my 16-year-old son decided to go on his first homecoming date. I know he asked someone, but I didn't hear much activity or conversation between himself and his mother about the upcoming event. I assumed that everything was going okay, but I finally decided to talk to him about it. I asked him, hey, can we talk a little bit about your date? Sure. And I said, well, have you picked a corsage? And he said, what's that? I said, it's the flower that you buy for your date that she wears on her dress. He goes, really? He goes, no, I haven't. He goes, well, how much will that cost me? I said, well, I don't know, probably 20, 25 bucks. He goes, you're kidding. And I said, and you got to make sure that you pick the right color. And he said, well, why is that? I said, well, you don't want to pick a flower or have a corsage made that clashes with the colors of her dress. So you need to check out the colors of her dress. Really? I said, do you have to rent a tux? He goes, why? And I said, well, usually these occasions, if it says formal, require you to wear a tux. And he said, you've got to be kidding me. I said, no, I'm not. He goes, what will that cost me? I said, anywhere from maybe $80 to $100. Then I said, well, what are you doing on this kind of date? He says, well, I'm going with friends and we're going to a restaurant. I go, well, have you made a reservation? He goes, well, why would I want to have to do that? I said, well, if you're going in a group, and everybody in town is going out on dates, if you don't have a reservation, you may not get in to eat when you want to eat. So you got to have a reservation. And then he asked me, well, do I have to pay for her dinner? And I said, yes, you do. And don't forget to leave a tip. He goes, a tip? I go, yeah, it's usually 20 to 30% of the total bill. He goes, you're kidding. Anyway, we had a pretty long conversation, but I was certainly glad that I didn't assume that he understood all the elements that were required in taking a young lady to the homecoming dance. And he was glad that I didn't either, because what we discovered is having never done this before, there were a whole lot of things that he didn't know how to do. Secondly, our perception leads us to assume negative intentions on the part of the people that we're interacting with. For example, recently I got an email from my book agent that said, gosh, we've got some great news about your book. We need to talk soon. Well, I didn't know whether to be encouraged or discouraged by the text, so I responded, well, what's the news? Don't keep me hanging. Is it good news or it's bad news? Please don't keep me hanging. A few minutes later, she emailed back, oh, you're so funny. Nothing else. Well, it was a Friday afternoon. What do you think I thought for the next 2 days? Did she like the manuscript? Has she spoken with the publishing contact? Do they like it? Maybe they don't like it. Maybe they won't want to even publish the book. That's how it goes, isn't it? We don't have all the information, so what we do is make it up in the worst possible way. Third, our perception drives our behavior and in turn creates our results. Let's talk about that for a moment. Let's assume we have two people, Jim and Sue. And Jim observes that Sue is entering his office. Now, Jim has a mental model of Sue, and that mental model is that sometimes Sue is kind of dramatic, has a lot of emotion. So what he does then is takes that selected piece of data that Sue often is dramatic, filters it through his mental models, puts the crown on her head, and then assumes or interprets that Sue is the drama queen, and dealing with her is going to be difficult. That interpretation of Jim's then causes him to be somewhat exasperated before Sue even opens her mouth. That emotion in turn drives his reaction, which does this. He acts in such a way that his behavior elicits in Sue the very results that he needs to see to keep thinking that Sue's the drama queen. Bottom line, the way that Jim feels and acts creates or reinforces the perception that Jim originally held of Sue. The same process is also at play as Sue observes Jim. Sue, let's say, observes Jim. And what she selects when she sees Jim is that sometimes Jim does and says stupid things. She takes that, filters it through her mental models again, and then interprets Jim is just stupid. The emotion that she experienced from that interpretation of hers is frustration. Frustration at the prospect of having to deal with Jim. That emotion then elicits in her a reaction, which causes her to behave in such a way, or if you want, the results causes Jim to act stupid, so that Sue then can in turn observe the very things she needs to observe that reinforces her thinking that Jim is in fact stupid. In that way then, the way we perceive people or events or situation often causes us to behave in such a way that what we elicit with our behavior is the very thing that we need to see that reinforces the way we think, where we say, yeah, I knew it was that way. So how do we improve our process of perception? There's a number of things we need to learn to do. First, we need to take the time to just stop and think. If you find yourself emoting or being negative, your emotion can actually become the cue to you noticing that there is a thought behind it. For every emotion we experience, there is some thought that precedes it. Just taking a moment to say, okay, what am I thinking at the moment? Then we need to learn to challenge the accuracy of our perceptions. Years ago, I was sitting on an airplane that just so happened to land in a major U.S. city, and there was a woman sitting next to me who was blind. She had in the seat between us her seeing eye dog. After most of the passengers had exited the plane, the pilot came back and said, "Miss Eve, how are you doing?" "I'm doing fine. Nice to see you again," the pilot said. "Is there anything I can do for you while we're just kind of laid over here for about 20 minutes? She said, "It would surely be nice if you could take Buddy for a little stroll in the terminal before we take off again." "Sure," said the pilot. With that, he grabbed the harness on the dog, led him out into the aisle, put on his sunglasses, and started up the aisle to exit the plane. I thought that this would be too good to miss, so I followed him. Sure enough, he came up the jetway, and as he came out, the ticket attendant greeted him, and he walked by with the seeing dog in tow with sunglasses on. Person standing right next to the attendant waiting to get on the plane said, "Who is that?" He says, "Oh, that's the pilot." "You're kidding," said the person. Immediately, as I walked past, people got out of line and went to the gate agent and started asking if they could get on another flight. I just had to chuckle as I watched the pilot walk the dog in the airport and then got on in the same manner. People, seeing that, automatically assumed that they had a blind pilot. All they were really doing is taking the information that they were observing and assembling it and making some pretty broad assumptions that were obviously incomplete and inaccurate. So how do we challenge the accuracy of our perceptions? Just need to learn to ask yourself, is what I'm thinking absolutely true? If there is no data that supports what it is that you're thinking, or even if there's one little piece of data that runs counter to what you're thinking, then you know that there's a likelihood that what you're thinking is inaccurate or at least incomplete. We need to learn to recognize and assess the thinking that creates our results. Bottom line, just because you think something doesn't make it so. It only means that you think it. Let's talk about the second barrier, a lack of awareness. Why don't we recognize conversation dynamics? It's pretty easy. We just haven't been trained to recognize what's happening in the moment. We haven't been trained to see the tacit elements at play and understand what those tacit elements are really telling us. For example, years ago, I had the opportunity to coach a senior executive who had given me permission to coach him in front of his people. He was in a team meeting. He was getting pretty upset with somebody about some things that she hadn't accomplished. So he actually started kind of yelling. I said to him as he was doing so, "Jim, have you noticed what color Holly is?" And he stopped and looked and said, "Well, she's red." I said, "What do you think that means?" "That she's upset," he said. "Why don't you ask her?" "Holly, you're upset?" She says, "I'm absolutely offended the way you're speaking to me right now." Now, it wasn't that he didn't intend to be frustrating or angry or even offensive. He just was, and he didn't recognize the cues that were taking place at the moment. so that he could manage them. That's kind of how it shows up. So notice that the meaning of visual, verbal, and vocal cues often go unidentified. And to make matters worse, we just don't see ourselves as we are seen. For example, what if the picture on the slide was you talking to somebody? If someone could hold up that picture of you, you'd probably be a little surprised that that's how you were coming across when you really didn't intend that. I had a very personal experience happen to me years ago when I was early on in my career. The second morning of a 2-day training, I had a participant come in early and approach me and ask, "Were you mad at us yesterday in the afternoon?" I go, "No, why do you ask that?" "Well, we were asking a bunch of questions, and you just looked, I don't know, just really angry," the student shared. I'd been told years ago that I was real high on thought, and I realized with that bit of feedback that when I had to think deeply to answer student questions that I was presenting I guess a serious face that some were interpreting as anger. Consequently, I realized that I had to make a conscious effort to smile as I was talking and answering questions so as not to be misinterpreted as being angry. So, what do we do to improve on lack awareness? We need to learn to take the time to be both an observer and a participant in a conversation. And what do we mean by that? Well, being an observer is about watching, observing what is happening in a conversation, and then managing it. Being a participant is about being immersed in the content, listening to what's going on, thinking, and being able to respond. So when we see things happen that we don't understand, for example, let's say that you're talking to someone and they roll their eyes. You just want to check that out by asking a question. So you might ask, "I wonder if you really don't agree with what I'm saying," and let them answer. So you use questions to check out, if you will, the behavior or nonverbal behavior that you're seeing. Learning to recognize the cues and manage them in conversation will ensure that your conversations are successful. You want to be clear about everything you are observing in conversation. Let's talk about the third barrier. Emotion is a barrier. People avoid emotional reaction or defensiveness. Why? Sometimes they know who has a tendency to get emotional. And even though they do that, they just don't see it coming. And then it kind of shows up all of a sudden. So we either avoid those people that we have a history with that we know they become emotional or defensive, or when it happens, we really don't know how to manage it. So we either do what? Get emotional on ourselves, which doesn't help the conversation at all, or we withdraw, we avoid it. Sometimes we're even afraid that we ourselves will become emotional, that we're going to respond in kind. And if there's a likelihood of doing that in a particular conversation on a particular topic, most of the time we'll avoid holding the conversation to avoid our own emotional reaction. So, how do we manage our emotion? One, well, we need to take the time to accelerate through emotion. Well, what do we mean by that? Years ago, I had a general manager who was a dear friend who told me, as we were talking about conflict, that leaders needed to learn to accelerate through conflict to what was on the other side. I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And he says, "Well, you know that I drive Formula One race cars for a hobby." And I did know that. So he said, "Let me just ask you a question. If you were going 180 miles per hour into a turn, and here you come, what would you do?" I said, I guess I'd just tap on the brakes a little bit going into the turn. And he said, "That is the last thing you'd want to do, because if you did it, you'd flip the car." Then he offered that, although it is counterintuitive, actually one would need to step on the gas and accelerate into the turn, that would drive the tires and the frame of the car into the turn, increasing the stability of the vehicle. He said managing conflict or particular hot emotion, when presented with it, is the same way. You have to accelerate through the conflict to discover the meaning on the other side. So notice, discovering the hidden meaning behind the emotion occurs by asking questions. Asking questions allows us to understand the story that the person has, and everybody's got a story, and what's hidden in the story is what people wanted or their expectations that were violated, and personal values as well. We get to that by asking questions. So to manage emotion, we need to learn that emotional reaction really signals violated values. We get to those values by asking questions. I like to think about it this way. Emotion is the mask of meaning. By accelerating through the emotion or diffusing it, we allow people to take off the mask of emotion and get to the meaning that's behind it. We do that by asking questions. The fourth barrier is knowing how to begin a tough or difficult conversation, which isn't always easy. Why? Most of the time, our past experience shapes our current perception of the situation. And we're already probably feeling anxious because we have a fear of the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen, so we're uncomfortable from the beginning. Then, out of inexperience, people will begin a conversation with a judgment or a blame, or even by making a demand. Let me give you an example. One of our trainers recently told a story of a person she had in her class. She was speaking, and all of a sudden this class participant cut her off mid-sentence, looked right at her, and said, "Mahatma Gandhi." She was somewhat surprised, actually shocked would probably be more descriptive. And not knowing what to do, she just kept speaking. About a minute later, the same participant offered, "Man, you're rude. You just cut me off." Well, she had to ask, so she said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I had a quote from Mahatma Gandhi I wanted to share with the class, and you wouldn't let me." Notice that he started the conversation by blaming her or accusing her of being rude and cutting him off. Not exactly the best way to start the conversation. And yet that's what we do. We start with blame or judgment. We might say, for example, "Man, you blew that presentation today." Well, notice you say that to somebody, immediately they become defensive. So how do we start? We want to start by focusing attention, the attention of our listener. And the way that we do this is by doing what we call using an attention check. There's two ways to kind of do this. One, we focus attention of our listener by sharing our intention. "I'd like to talk about," and then finish the sentence. Then we ask for permission. "Can we do that now?" Now the question that we ask for permission isn't creative, so you might ask, "Can we do that? Do you have a moment? Is now a good time?" Let's go back and use the example I just told in the story. Let's suppose the gentleman that wants to share a quote. He could have started the conversation by just saying, raising his hand and saying, "I have an interesting quote to share with the class. May I do that?" That would have signaled to the trainer what he wanted to do. And I mean, who wouldn't have said, "Well, sure, go ahead." Or let's use an attention check on the situation where he blurted out and accused her of being rude. Instead of doing that, what if he had said, "I'd like to talk about how we just interacted for a moment. Can we do that?" The only warning I'll give you about focusing the attention of your listener by sharing your intention is just to make sure that it's neutral. So if you said, "I'd like to talk about your presentation that you gave this morning. Can we do that?" Notice that's very different than saying something like, "I'd like to talk about how you blew that presentation this morning. Is now a good time?" The one creates openness and engagement. The other creates resistance and defensiveness. Just know, bottom line, that what begins well ends well. Beginning well will help your conversation not only begin well, but go smoothly and come to resolution in the end. Let's talk about questions as a barrier. Asking questions is a deliberate act to increase our understanding. What do I mean by deliberate act? Well, it just doesn't occur on its own. You have to think about what you want to know and ask a question. This was pretty interesting for me as I created this presentation to interview a number of executives and ask them why they didn't ask questions. Here's what they said. One, we just think we know. So if we think we know what people are going to say, we just don't ask. Others said, well, we really don't want to know. We just want what we want, so why ask? Others said, well, we don't want to reveal what we don't know. And I go, what do you mean? Well, if my boss told me to do something and I totally didn't understand, I'm not going to say, well, you know, I really wasn't very clear on that. Could you explain that again? It's easier to go to a coworker and ask them what my boss was actually really saying. They don't want to ask a question to reveal that they either didn't understand or that they weren't listening, or maybe both. This next one I thought was very interesting. We don't want to ask questions because we don't want to create the illusion in people that will do something if they give us their answer. It's just easier to say we want this and then do it. And then there was one I didn't add that I'll add. Some just said we don't want to take the time. We don't have the time to ask questions and listen to people's responses. Notice that by asking questions, we reveal ourselves by the quality of the questions that we ask. But we also allow others to reveal themselves in the quality of the answers that they give. So what do? Well, we want to seek understanding. And we do that by taking the time to ask questions, actually good questions, to increase your understanding. So what's a good question? A good question is a question that will get you the answer that you are seeking. What that necessitates is you do a little thinking or preparation beforehand and just ask yourself, what is it that you really want to know? That will help you create the question that will get you the answer. By asking questions, we also demonstrate care and concern for the individual by trying to clarify our own understanding or misunderstanding. And finally, you ought to take the time to ask questions because it's one of the easiest ways to create respect. Why? Because it creates the assumption that you're going to listen and respond to what other people have to say. But you have to be careful. You can't ask questions and not listen. For example, years ago, where I was teaching dialogue and conversation skills to a client, I was gone for about 6 months, and then I was asked to come back and kind of check up on the work that we'd done. I thought I'd wander out on the shop floor and talk to a bunch of the individuals who were working to see how things were going. I asked them how things were going, and here's what I heard. Well, my supervisor recently asked me what I thought, and I told him, and when I finished, he said, well, next time I'll ask an expert. Another person said, well, my supervisor asked me what I thought, and I started telling her, and she walked off and left me talking to myself. I had taught these people in leadership positions how important it was to ask questions, but they hadn't understood how important it was for people to just take the time to listen and respond to what people were saying. Essentially, they asked questions and then shot themselves in the foot because what they did in their behavior was totally discredit their credibility. So bottom line, if you don't want to know, don't ask. You don't have the time. Take the time if you have it, but if you can't, postpone it to another time. Let's talk about another barrier. Bottom line, the lack of skills can also be a barrier. Recently, my spouse and I were standing in line to attend a movie, and there was an older couple, probably in their 80s, standing in front of us. They had, who seemed to appear to be a daughter, probably in her mid-20s, standing with them. As we were waiting to buy our tickets, the mother and the daughter started to get a little exercise. Finally, the young woman yelled at her mother, saying, "Mother, arguing about $2 for a movie ticket is not worth it." She stamped her foot and marched off. I was a little surprised by the interaction, but it seems like sarcasm, yelling and screaming and withdrawing seemed to be more the preferred conversational skills of the day. When I mentioned that to my spouse, she said, "Absolutely. Haven't you watched TV lately? The way we're all socialized to talk in the media is to use sarcasm, yell, scream, and then eventually withdraw. It's almost like we communicate by making a bombing run, fly in, dump off the bomb, and fly off, where we don't really even talk about things that are important. In fact, a person I'm coaching currently recently told me, after she'd been assigned a new supervisor and things had gone pretty well, the supervisor decided to pay her a visit. She came in and said, "How's it going?" "Good." How are the current deadlines coming, shaping up?" Good. Good, she said. And then abruptly she looked at her and just said, just note, if you don't meet those deadlines, I'm giving you a bad review. And off she marched. Wow, talk about blaming and accusing without even recognizing the person was doing good work is not exactly the way to hold a tough or a difficult or even hold a good conversation. It just seems that people seem to lack the knowledge and the skills as well as a process for talking about what matters most. So what are the skills for holding a good conversation? We call them the real skills for success. You'll notice that the skills for holding any difficult conversation and being effective are what we would call recognizing and suspending, express, ask, and listening and attending. Notice they form the acronym REAL. Recognizing and suspending is just about recognizing either what's happening, so notice there's an awareness piece there, and changing it if it's not working. Or if you want, it's being able to recognize your own thinking and suspending that, putting it in abeyance so that your behavior is more congruent with what you know. If you want to make it simple, it's about being open. Expressing is just about sharing ideas, thoughts, and opinions. Asking is about asking questions. And listening and attending is about listening with our ears and attending with the rest of us. Those are the skills of any difficult conversation. The process is easy as well. It's a four-step process that we refer to as initiate, discover, and connect and build. These four steps are present as a process in any conversation that you want to hold. Let me illustrate by giving you a scenario of how it might sound. Let's suppose that we got George and Sally. They've been married a couple years. They have 2 children. George has been on a long business trip. He comes in, a little towards evening, starts hugging his spouse, looks around the room and says, "Wow, this place is a dump." Immediately, Sally shrugs him off, says, "I'm sick of you criticizing me," bolts upstairs. George feels absolutely terrible. Doesn't know what to do, so he kind of decides he's going to wait downstairs until Sally comes down. Starts picking up a few things, picks up everything, vacuums, straightens, takes out the trash, plops down on the carpet, and starts playing with his kids. Finally, Sally comes down. Watch how George is going to initiate. Can we talk about what just happened for a minute? Could we? "I guess," Sally says. "Well, I made a comment, and you became upset and left. I'm thinking that this has been building for some time, and maybe you thought you couldn't bring it up with me." Notice what he did in initiation. He started with an attention check, he shared facts or data, and then he shared his thinking. But he ends that with, "Gosh, Sally, what's going on?" As soon as he ends with that question, he moves to discovery. Here's what Sally says. "You know what? You always criticize me for how the house looks, and I'm sick of it." George says, "Gosh, I'm sorry." "Well, you know, when I make such comments, do you notice what I usually or often do?" George asks. Sally thinks for a minute. "Well, just now you cleaned up. Could you accept that I'm not making a criticism of you? I'm just kind of thinking out loud, I guess. And my comments are not really a criticism. What do you think?" "I guess, but I still have a hard time with you thinking out loud, as you call it," Sally says. Well, Sally gets really quiet and then just says, "You know, I try my best. That's all I want you to know." "Well, why didn't you tell me if you felt this way about my comments?" "Well, you work really hard, and I know you've been gone, and I just didn't feel like bringing it up. In fact, then I never really bring it up." All that is discovery. Now watch how George connects. "So, gosh, Sally, it sounds like you like the house to be picked up, and so do I. And you would rather that I did not think out loud, is that right?" "Yeah." "Well, I'd like you not to hold things in. I'd really like it for you to tell me when you have something that's really irritated you and that you're not telling me. That's what I'd like. Have I understood correctly? Yeah? So notice what George really did in connection. He summarized what he heard from all the questions that he asked in discovery to make sure that he'd understood. He summarized her values or wants and his own. Now he's going to move to building. Well, what do you think we should do? George asks. Well, I'd really like it if you'd quit making comments about how the house looked, even if you're just thinking out loud. Okay. And George then says, well, I'd like it if you're upset with me, that rather than holding it in, that what you'll do is either look for an opportunity or create an opportunity to talk to me about it within 24 hours of it happening. What do you think? Think you could do that? Sure, I could do that. If you'll do that, then I'll work on watching my thinking out loud, George says. So notice, in building, they come up with solutions for change in behavior, and then they gain one another's commitment. That's the process of initiate, discover, and connect and build. Bottom line, you must have the tools and know how to use them. So learning the skills for holding any difficult or tough conversation and the process to do it is critical for having success in holding that conversation. Let's talk about the last barrier, which is listening. Bottom line, and this is probably the #1 complaint, people don't listen. Why? They think that they know what you're going to say. You can tell that this is happening because they cut you off or talk over you or finish your sentences. Sometimes they're just thinking about what you're going to say next. So the two kind of work in concert. They think they know what you're going to say, so they don't listen because they're too busy thinking about what they're going to say next. And that's what they offer when they cut you off. Also, we're often preoccupied with the voice in our head. I call this head speak. We all have a little voice in our head that is judging, editorializing, or commenting on everything that people are saying or doing. So if you're focused on what a person is going to say or you think they're going to say and what you're going to say next, or if you're really giving your attention and listening to the voice in your head, you cannot obviously give your full listening and attention to somebody else, which means that you're really not hearing them. So what do we need to do to increase or improve our listening skills? We need to take the time to be present and manage your listening. For example, if you got 5 minutes to prepare for a meeting and someone comes in and says they really need to talk, not a good time to listen. You'd be better off to manage that and just say, I can't talk right now. Could we talk in 2 hours? You need to be patient. Listening takes time. If you don't have the time, you can't take it. And if you can't take the time, then you need to manage that. We need to be attentive and learn to attend to what people are not saying. Oftentimes the things they're not saying show up in the tone of their voice or the nonverbals they display. So as we talked about earlier, if you're attentive and you see somebody rolling their eyes, or if their tone says, yeah, I'll do that, the tone says, really, I have a problem with that. And you want to ask questions to understand what that's all about. That's what being proactive is about. Being proactive is asking questions to clarify what it is that you think you've understood or what you're saying and don't necessarily understand. Let me give you an example. Years ago, on a Christmas night, after all the kids were in bed, you know how it is, you're utterly exhausted, sat down at the kitchen table, cut myself a piece of chocolate cake, started to eat it, and thumbed through the LL Bean catalog. My spouse came in and said, could we talk for a minute? Sure, I said. What do you want to talk about? And she starts talking. I keep eating and keep thumbing. After about 5 minutes, she says, you have not heard a thing I've said. I go, sure I have. Wrong answer. She goes, prove it. And I literally could rehearse back to her, repeat back to her everything she said. So angry, she says, you just do not get it. I can handle the chocolate cake. It's the magazine I can't handle. And off she stormed. Was I present? Not really. Was I attentive? No. Was I asking questions to clarify? No. Bottom line, 3 out of the 4, I didn't do a very good job. So just note that when we're talking about really listening to someone, this is something that you can't fake it till you make it. You have to be present, patient, attentive, and proactive as you listen to others. So what will it take? If we summarize, we need to learn to challenge our perceptions. We do this by asking ourselves questions to determine if our perceptions or what we're thinking is absolutely true. And if it's not, then we need to explore other alternatives. Increasing our awareness has to do with starting to recognize all the tacit elements that accompany any conversations that we often miss just because we're not aware of them. We need to learn to manage emotion, ours and that of others. We do that by asking questions, getting people to tell their story, and identifying what people really want. By the way, asking questions pushes a person to a different part of their brain, which is a way of accelerating through their emotion and getting to the meaning that's behind it. Beginning well is about knowing how to start a conversation. We do that with an attention check by focusing our listeners' attention and asking for permission to engage them. Finally, we seek understanding by asking questions. Good questions are well thought out and help us gain the information that we need. We want to internalize the skills and the process for holding any tough or difficult conversation. We want to learn about recognizing and suspending, expressing, asking, listening, and attending, the skills to use, and the process for using it. Initiate, discover, connect, and build. Finally, we want to learn to listen and to attend what's going on. Once we have a handle on these particular principles, we want to practice till our conversations improve and we're really a master communicator. Appreciate you taking the time to listen a little bit today. I hope you've gained an understanding for why our conversations don't often work very well and become clear on the 7 barriers to all effective communication. Taking steps to overcome those barriers will only help you increase your conversation effectiveness. I wish you good luck. Have a great day.